Hey, so I made a video a couple days ago for part of this NaNoWriMo video collection set that I'm trying to make, but the sound was really bad, so I'm going to make a new one now. And it's going to cover basically two things. On the one hand, I want to talk about the difference between the analytical and the intuitive side of creative production or creativity, which is a really interesting conversation that I got from a Time special on creativity recently. Maybe a few months ago, Time had a special episode on the science of creativity, and it was actually kind of weird because they didn't talk about the science at all. They just kind of mentioned a whole bunch of random famous creative people and some of the things that they do. So this was one of the few but very interesting things that I got out of that magazine, so I'll touch a little bit about on that later. But the main reason I'm making these videos is to talk about the process of writing while I'm working on a NaNoWriMo novel. So this is a one book in a month, a novel in a month, a 30-day challenge. It's supposed to be 50,000 words. For math reasons, I find it a little bit easier to think in terms of 60,000 words. That just makes it really easy to break up. So I made a video a few days ago. I think I was on like day 5, and I was talking about how I was stuck because I had overwritten and I hadn't reached the inciting incident yet, and my challenge was to get to the first plot point, which is the point of no return when the heroine goes on her adventure. So I finished that step. I got to my first plot point, and that's kind of what I want to talk about now. So it's actually kind of cool to have this process. I already had the plot structure, this 9-point or 8-point guide. It looks kind of like a clock to plotting fiction. This is the first time I've really used it deliberately and kind of watched myself going through the process to see how that works. So a few days ago, I was actually behind because I had gotten to my inciting incident. I had a big show of force with the antagonist's forces, upping the stakes, showing the violence or the risk, and I still had to make my protagonist choose to go out on the quest anyway, which is kind of the challenge. Generally, you want the call to adventure to be thwarted or refused at first, and then the protagonist has to be like forced onto the adventure with the door closing. So it's kind of a choice, but it's not the deliberate choice that the protagonist would have made. They're a little bit they're forced into action. It's not like they just want to go out on this adventure. So I barely got to that point. I was pretty happy when I got to that point. Probably a couple days ago now I made that video, but the sound was pretty terrible. So I'm making this video to kind of talk about where I was and where I am in that novel and where I need to go from here. So now is actually like day 10, which means I'm kind of behind because I was really excited to get to that point. That's basically 25% of the way into the novel. I'm fine on word count, actually. I probably have almost 20,000 words already, so that's more words than I need at this point to be 25% of the way into the novel. If this is an NaNoWriMo novel, you're doing 50,000 words. By 25%, you should really just be at like 12,000 words roughly, something like that, to get to this first 25% point of no return. And to get there, what I had to do was first, they have to find out what they need to do, like what's the quest. So the first challenge was she had to be investigating something, to find something else, to know who to talk to or who to ask or who to interview. Hold on a second, there's a plane going up ahead. It's kind of noisy where I am in Chiang Mai, but hopefully the sound's better on this video. So my challenge was, she discovered what's next. She discovered she has to go to Egypt because she needs to find this way to untangle this spell before she can kill the final antagonist. That's kind of the plot, the final plot of the series, not quite of this book, but she doesn't know that yet. So she kind of tracks down the clues. She figures out where she has to go, but then she's refused. So the ally, who is not exactly an antagonist, the person who's in charge of the space she's in, forbids her to leave and go on this quest to find the thing that she needs to find. And he says she's not ready, so before she can go on that quest, she has to prove herself, and that could take months or years, so she's really frustrated. So two things happen. On the one hand, Zeus, who's the main antagonist, raises the stakes by piling on even more violence. There's some other extenuating circumstances. Things get a lot more dangerous and dire. So she really is propulsed or forced to, to prove herself, to win, to jump through these hoops, so that she's allowed to go on this adventure. Also, she gets a special new weapon. She gets a little bit of help from the other Greek gods, and she basically surprises everybody and proves herself worthy. She meets the requirements that this guy has set for her, even though no one expected her to. And so that's where I was at 25%. So I got to this point. I actually didn't even flesh it all out. I haven't even really written these scenes yet, but I figured out what has to happen. And so that's a really exciting thing when I talk about analytical versus intuitive, because some people say that when you plot or when you outline your book, you're killing the inspiration. It doesn't feel as good. And I had this conversation with a few other people before. A lot of people, they love writing because they're passionate about it. So they love to dive into their manuscript. They love to just write and write and write. The passion flows through them, but then they get stuck because they don't know what happens next. They can't continue it. They can't continue the story. They don't know how to turn their passion for writing into an actual finished book. And that's a problem with plotting. But the interesting thing is you can't solve all the plotting steps until you're there. You kind of have to write through the problem. So in my case, I knew where I had to go to get to at the 25% mark, but I didn't know how exactly to get there. I felt like I was probably several chapters away. I actually managed to do it in about one chapter. So basically two different scenes, which is about a chapter. But when I started writing those, I was demotivated because I was behind. I wasn't at the 25% point that I needed to be at yet, and I didn't know what had to happen to get me to that point, which is kind of the miracle of writing. So even though I had plotted this out, even though I know where I'm going and where the end of this book needs to get to, I didn't know how to solve this problem to get from point A to B. And you never know when you're writing because you can't solve the problem until you get there. So that's where the intuitive comes in. The analytical side is just ramming your head against the wall and trying to solve the problem. But then you need to take a step back and sit with the discomfort and be comfortable with the discomfort and allow your brain to do the magic and fill in the gaps and solve those problems. You can't see those problems until you get there. So you have to do it step by step and write forward to finish a scene and then get stuck in the next scene. And it's kind of a constant battle. So every day, especially for NaNoWriMo, if you're trying to do it in a month, it's frustrating and kind of difficult, but it happens. And so the interesting thing from this Time article was saying that the intuitive process of creative production is more satisfying because it feels miraculous and it feels like you're pulling down this wisdom from the muse or the inspiration. And that's why readers or writers, that's why a lot of writers, pantsers especially, love the process, the creative process, but hate the idea of plotting or story architecture because it won't feel as good. It won't be as satisfying. And what I think is really important, and I've said this in different ways in other videos, but you can't expect writing to be fun all of the time. It does take work. The writers who are successful, they don't expect it to always have fun writing. There are very difficult and frustrating and challenging pieces of writing. You're deliberately going to the step of the point of ambiguity where you don't know the next thing. You don't know what happens next, and you're choosing to step off into that unknowing. You're choosing to put yourself at the mercy of the universe to fill in the gaps, and you're expecting the trust or the hope or the faith. The more that you do the writing, the more you're going to be comfortable with this step, but you're always putting yourself into the unknown and trusting that answers will come to you. And that's a weird position to be in. So like I said a couple days ago, I was frustrated because I didn't know where to be. I'll talk about where I am right now. I've basically gotten to that 25% point. So now I need to get to the first pinch point, which is kind of the first battle, the first actual physical battle with the forces of the antagonist. And then I need to get to the midpoint where there's a major shift in how the protagonist sees herself. And something probably happens that forces her resolve, or hardens her resolve, so that, you know, even though this is a third book, she's not fully committed to doing the things that she's going to need to do, because she doesn't have enough personal hatred of the antagonist yet. I'm really going to hit that hard at my midpoint. I'm going to have a really kind of shocking thing happen in this book. It's the third book in the series, so I'm taking the stuff up, the drama up to a higher level. It's all going to make sense in terms of, you know, the background, the characters that are in this book, but it is going to be a little shocking for my readers. I'm not quite sure how they're going to feel about what I'm going to do in this book, but I'm quite happy with where I'm going to get to. The problem is, by day 15, which now is the 10th, so I have like 5 more days to finish 25% of the book. And like I said, I already have a lot of words. And the middle of the book, like, it's kind of another 25%, but actually if it's a little shorter, that's okay. This is kind of, when I write my first 50K or when I write my NaNoWriMo novel, I'm just trying to write a quick, rough draft. I'm just trying to figure out what happened. So even if I don't flesh out every scene, even if I only have the basic notes of the scenes to fill the gap so I know exactly what happens and I can move on to the next point, I'm okay with that, because I can do a lot of the revising and rewriting during the next stage, like the revision process, the editing process. The hard part for me is getting the first draft done and knowing exactly what happens. It can't totally just be mapped out before you start. You have to actually go in and go scene by scene, chapter by chapter, to fill in the blanks, to figure out how to move from point A to point B. So I have a lot of, when I started this book, and you can go back, I'm going to put this in a series, so I'm going to, you can go back to the first video in this series to see like how I started the outlining process for this book. Yeah, and I think that's a kind of long video. I'll probably publish some of these like after I finish this book and it's published. We'll see how that goes. But I already had done a lot of research. I already knew who my main antagonists are. I had like 2 or 3 separate side quests or side plot events, character arcs. There's some other stuff going on in this story which isn't really the main stuff. And there's a side antagonist, which is Hera, in this book. So even though Zeus is active and Zeus is doing things, Hera is the main antagonist in this book, but she doesn't totally know that yet. So at this point, all I have to do, I have, like today and yesterday, actually figured out, even though I didn't do any writing, I kind of took a day off, I did fill in some really critical plot events. That's kind of what I did this morning. Another plane, hold on just a second, and I'll finish this video up pretty quickly. So it's not all about writing. Like, I didn't just sit down this morning to write, because the thing that I need to do now is figure out what happened. So you can always see further ahead the more you've written. So now that I'm at the 25% mark, I can see the next step much more clearly. So the 25% to the 50% mark, I don't think there's names for like the first quarter of a book, the second quarter of a book, but there should be. I might go back and rename those in my outline so I have a kind of something to say when I'm talking about these different stages. But I need to go from the point of no return to the first half of the quest, which is basically like battles with the antagonist and raising stakes, and a little bit of discovery. Like, she's on her quest now, so she's going to be increasingly challenged by, you know, the opposing forces. So those things, she has to go on a little bit of an adventure. She's going to be in Egypt. She's going to meet some other antagonists who are against her for different reasons on her quest to figure out how to entangle this spell. She's looking for Isis, basically. Isis is going to give her some new magical toys, and then something's going to happen. Like, after she's successfully met with Isis and gotten a hint that will lead her closer to the fulfillment of her goal, something bizarre and tragic is going to happen, which is a major setback, and that's going to be my midpoint. So I only have to figure out what happens until the 50% mark. I don't need to plot out everything towards the end in great detail yet, even though I basically know how the rest of the book is going to go. I don't have like the scene by scene outline done, because that's difficult to do from the very beginning. When I get to the midpoint, then I'm going to be able to go back and you know, plan the next few chapters. So I've basically gone down, I've sat through I think in my 26 chapter outline, each section of the book has 3 chapters, which is just a rough estimate. So I should have done something like 6 to 12 chapters in 6 chapters, I guess, in just this quarter of the book until the midpoint. So I basically mapped out not even 6 chapters. I just mapped out like 6 potential scenes or 6 potential sites of conflict. I like all of my chapters to end kind of on a cliffhanger, in serious danger. So you don't want, like, every chapter, every scene, there will be a balance between like something happens, a reaction or running away from the danger, regrouping, and then a mapping out or setting the next goal. So the protagonists are always going step by step, like take 1 step forward, get thwarted, take 2 steps back, regroup, replan. But the important part of every chapter is the major conflict or the battle. Even if it's not a literal battle, it's the really bad stuff that happens. So when I'm mapping out the next 5 or 6 chapters, I don't need to map out, the reaction or what they do next or the plan. I just map out like the major points of conflict or contention where they're in immediate confrontation with forces, antagonistic forces. That's kind of what I make my headlines for my chapters. Then I'll go back in through while I'm writing, and I'll figure out, what does that chapter actually look like? What do those scenes look like? Where do they have to go? What's the background? Anyway, so I'm not sure if this totally helps, but I do think it's really interesting, the balance between analytic and intuitive. I do think they're both imperative. I think everyone's always going to be a little more comfortable with both. And there's this great quote from a philosopher that I took from my PhD research in Paradise Lost. We used it a lot, which is basically when Satan in Paradise Lost is stepping off of the void of the abyss. And Kierkegaard, but a lot of other philosophers, a lot of other psychologists have really used this particular scene in Paradise Lost as the basis for psychoanalysis. Freud references it, but Kierkegaard was one of the earliest ones to use this scene from Paradise Lost to talk about the terrifying abyss of freedom when you're stepping off the void, and that's kind of the human knowledge is always a quest for freedom, a quest into the unknown, and trusting the muse, the universe, whatever, trusting that, you will be okay. So like there's always the temptation to just do what you know and do what's comfortable for you, but part of the writing process is always stepping into the unknown and allowing insight to come to you. And that is the most satisfying part of writing. That's never fully fleshed out. Even if you completely plot everything, there's always some form of discovery in the writing process, so it doesn't get dampened out. I know some people say like, well, I wouldn't enjoy it if I plotted or I outlined it. If it was like, if I was just trying to write books that sell, it wouldn't be as much fun. So I only do writing because it's fun. So I'm skeptical of comments like that, because those usually come from writers who never finish books or have never finished a successful book, and they usually just have like a whole bunch of fun scenes, but it never holds water. Basically, you need a really tight structure to make it satisfying for readers, and that can be accidental. I have pantser friends who can just pant a novel and it's entertaining and satisfying, even if it's not very well structured. It doesn't matter, because the characters and the action are so good that's very satisfying anyway. So there, you don't necessarily have to plot an outline, but what I always tell, especially writers who have trouble finishing books, or they write books that just aren't satisfying for readers, plotting or story architecture is probably the thing that you need. And I do think it's really interesting seeing myself write this book. I've done books in the past. I've done NaNoWriMo in the past. But I'm much clearer about my story architecture now than I kind of ever have been. So now when I need to know what happens first, especially this is a 30-day novel. I need to finish, like I need to write 10 or 15,000 words in the next 5 days probably, which isn't actually difficult for me. But the difficult part is if I don't know what happens next, usually I would be tempted to take a few days off, be satisfied that I figured out one piece of the puzzle, take a few days off, then go back in and confront the next piece. But you don't actually need the days off. You can just finish one piece of the puzzle and then sit down and focus on the next piece, and then give yourself, a few hours, take a walk, do something else, change gears. But you don't have to take days off to allow yourself to figure out the problem, because I took the last 2 days off and I didn't know what happens next, but I couldn't figure out what happens next until I sit with the problem. So this morning I just had coffee, and I just opened my outline and I looked through my notes and all the stuff that I have, and I figured out, what has to happen in the next 4 or 5 scenes to get me to the midpoint. Until you try to figure out that problem, you're not going to be open to the answers. So you kind of need to throw yourself back in the discomfort, or throw yourself back in the battle faster. Anyway, so I'm kind of going to end this video here. This is part of a series. I'm sure I'll talk more about, how things are looking. But that's kind of where I am right now, which is always figuring out the next part before you go down and sit and do the writing. Later, hopefully today, I'll actually do some writing and try to put some words in. I don't exactly know what happens in the next 5 or 6 chapters that I need to get through in the next few days. But I need to start writing, and I need to figure out this chapter, the next scene, and the next scene, so that I can, keep figuring things out. And I need to do it kind of quickly. That's also kind of why I like the constraints of NaNoWriMo. And I also like the plotting deadlines, because now instead of finishing 50,000 words in a novel, and I'm only on day 10, so it's convenient to say, well, I've already written 20,000 words. I'm already ahead at 10 days, so I'll just take it easy, or it doesn't really matter if I finish or not. I want to have a finished novel. I want to get to the end of the book. I don't want to just have 50,000 words. That's my personal goal. So part of the really interesting thing about doing that, and also using the structure, is that I have time constraints. I know that in 5 days, by the 15th, I need to be at the 50% mark. I need to be at the midpoint of my book, which means I need to do some things today and tomorrow and the next day. Basically, with these 5 days, I have to do a chapter a day, which is 2 scenes, roughly 2,000 or 3,000 words per chapter, which is totally doable. I've gotten much better about writing quickly. The hard part, like I said, is figuring out what happens next. But the solution is not taking time off or writing more slowly. The solution is, sitting down with your outline and your notes and doing the work, figuring out what happens next, doing the work, putting in a couple hours of writing, 2,000 or 3,000 words. I can write 1,000 words an hour. Most people probably can if you actually sit down and do it. The hard part is not knowing what happens, so you have to always be solving the next step and figuring out what happens next, writing the scene, figuring out what happens next. It's a balance. You don't want to just be sitting down and writing and writing and writing. You're always writing to the next point of the unknown, the next edge of the cliff. And then you're going to, even if you think you know what happens in the book, when you write a scene, you're going to realize there's a gap between the end of this scene and the beginning of the next scene that you want to get to. You're always going to be discovering gaps as you go, and you need to stop and fill those gaps before you can continue. So it's the story architecture, the scaffolding. It's not just something you do at the beginning of your writing process. It's something you're continually doing as you're writing. You're plotting and outlining as you're drafting, and there are 2 cool, different, I'm almost tempted to say the plotting and the outlining is always analytical, and the drafting is always intuitive, but I'm not necessarily sure that's definitively true, but that's kind of just an interesting way of looking at it. So you're always kind of using those 2 tools back and forth together to even finish your first rough draft. And we're not even talking about good writing, or because the good writing, the polishing, the revising, that all comes way later. So at this point, you're not even trying to write a good book. You're just trying to figure out what happens and fill in the story gaps and the story holes. Anyway, so that's where I am now. I'm trying to write 20,000 words in the next 5 days to get to my midpoint. I'll make another video then and check in again and tell you where I am.